When I first arrived on your planet, I expected your greatest dangers to be things like volcanic eruptions or those giant rotating windstorms you call tornadoes. Instead, I discovered something far stranger. Humans can be perfectly calm about the earthquakes in their cities, yet panic instantly when someone whispers the words, national security. It's fascinating. That phrase seems to shut off debate, silence questions, and convince millions that any economic decision, no matter how expensive or contradictory, must be accepted without hesitation. Today, I want to explore why. Because beneath the slogans and speeches, a quiet truth is hiding in plain sight. Some of the biggest threats to a nation's long-term strength don't come from foreign enemies at all. They come from the economic choices a country makes for itself. Choices wrapped in comforting language that rarely matches the reality underneath. For decades, political leaders have discovered a remarkably effective shortcut for winning economic debates. Attach the phrase national security to whatever policy they want the public to accept, and suddenly the complexity disappears. Ordinary people who might otherwise ask difficult questions about cost, competition, or long-term consequences become hesitant to challenge something framed as patriotic or protective. It works because the term itself is emotionally loaded. It suggests danger, urgency, and loyalty all at once. Yet most of the time, it functions less as a strategy for protecting the nation and more as a marketing label designed to push controversial economic decisions through without scrutiny. When a tariff, subsidy, relocation plan, or technology restriction is presented as a matter of national survival, it becomes nearly impossible to separate genuine security concerns from political theater. Leaders know this, corporations know this, and the public rarely has the tools to decode it. As a result, policies that primarily benefit specific industries or political agendas are often sold as universal necessities, even when they weaken other parts of the economy. The illusion works because it feels safe, but the reality is that a country cannot build long-term strength by treating economic policy like a fear-based commercial. True security depends on competitiveness, adaptability, and the ability to understand trade-offs honestly, not on slogans that hide contradictions. And yet, over and over again, these slogans win. The story of America's economic rise and gradual dependence on the outside world begins with a moment of extraordinary advantage, the post-World War II era. While much of Europe and Asia lay in ruins, the United States emerged with its factories intact, its workforce energized, and its currency elevated to global dominance. For a few decades, this unique position created the illusion that American strength was permanent and self-sustaining. But as other nations rebuilt, invested, and modernized, U.S. corporations began discovering that their profits grew faster when production moved overseas or when machines took over tasks once performed by workers. These decisions weren't framed as cost-cutting strategies. They were sold as steps toward technological progress and global leadership. Slowly, quietly, the domestic industrial base thinned out. Supply chains stretched across continents. Critical materials, once mined or manufactured at home, were sourced from nations with lower costs and fewer protections. By the time Americans realized how deeply the system had shifted, they were dependent not only on foreign labor, but also on foreign infrastructure, processing, and distribution. This dependence didn't arrive through a single dramatic event. It accumulated over decades of decisions justified as good for growth. The irony is that the very policies meant to keep the nation competitive often pushed it toward vulnerability. What began as a position of overwhelming strength transformed into an intricate web of reliance that most citizens never saw forming. And because the changes happened gradually, wrapped in confident promises of efficiency and innovation, almost no one asked whether the foundation of American power was being quietly weakened in the process. The shift toward offshoring and automation wasn't driven by ideology or national priorities. It was driven by the simple arithmetic of corporate profit. When companies realized they could pay a fraction of US wages overseas, or replace entire departments with machines that never took breaks, never negotiated, and never joined unions, the financial incentive became irresistible. Executives framed these decisions as innovations that would keep America competitive, but the real competition they cared about was between firms, not nations. While shareholders celebrated rising margins, the country slowly lost the industrial depth that once made it formidable. Entire skills vanished from the workforce. Communities built around manufacturing hollowed out, and as machines replaced labor, productivity rose, but wages stagnated, widening an inequality gap that weakened the very consumer base the economy relied on. Corporations insisted that automation would free workers for better jobs, conveniently skipping the part where millions were left with no clear path to those jobs. Offshoring was similarly packaged as a patriotic evolution, proof that American companies were expanding globally, even though the expansion mostly meant relocating the nation's productive capacity. These choices made perfect sense for individual companies acting in a profit-driven system, but they did not make sense for a country trying to maintain long-term strength and security. The paradox is hard to ignore. At the exact moment policymakers claimed the nation needed to remain strong, the economic engine that once guaranteed that strength was being systematically outsourced and mechanized. Profit soared, but power dispersed. As globalization accelerated, the United States found itself tied to an increasingly fragile system of long-distance production, specialized materials, and international logistics. At first, this interconnected world looked like a triumph of efficiency. Goods arrived cheaply, shelves stayed full, and businesses enjoyed record profits. But beneath that surface, a deeper vulnerability formed. Critical technologies depended on rare minerals sourced from a handful of foreign regions. Pharmaceuticals relied on factories thousands of miles away. Electronics required components assembled in countries with their own political ambitions. Even military equipment, the most sensitive category of all, needed parts processed abroad before reaching American assembly lines. The more efficient the system became, the more catastrophic any disruption could be. A natural disaster, a geopolitical dispute, or even a single factory shutdown in another hemisphere could ripple across the US economy, halting production and exposing how dependent the nation had become on forces it could not control. Leaders continued to insist that globalization made America stronger, yet every new dependency meant the country surrendered a bit more of its strategic autonomy. What was sold as progress was, in many ways, a trade. Lower prices today in exchange for greater risk tomorrow. And because the system worked, until suddenly it didn't, few questioned how thin the margins of safety had become. The hidden cost wasn't visible on receipts or stock charts. It emerged only when crises revealed how little redundancy or domestic capacity remained. When tariffs returned to the center of American politics, they weren't introduced as economic tools, but as dramatic symbols in a larger performance about danger, pride, and national revival. Donald Trump understood that tariffs could be sold not as taxes, which they are, but as shields protecting American workers from predatory foreign powers. By framing them as heroic acts of defense, he transformed a complex policy into a simple, emotional storyline. The problem is that tariffs rarely operate the way their promoters describe. They do not punish foreign manufacturers. They raise prices on American consumers and restrict the choices available to American businesses. Yet in Trump's narrative, this painful trade-off becomes a noble sacrifice, a necessary hardship to save the nation from dependence on rivals like China. The political power of this message is undeniable. It turns economic frustration into patriotic loyalty and reframes global competition as a battle between good and evil. But as compelling as it sounds, the theater masks the deeper reality. Tariffs do not rebuild lost industries, and they do not reverse decades of offshoring. Instead, they trap the country in a defensive posture, protecting older sectors while limiting access to the advanced technologies needed for future competitiveness. The emotional appeal, amplified by dramatic speeches and slogans, makes it easy to believe that toughness equals strength. Yet, real strength requires strategy, not symbolism. The global race for electric vehicles is not a cultural rivalry, a national identity crisis, or a patriotic showdown. It is a competition for technological and economic leadership in the industries that will define the next century. Yet in the United States, the debate is often framed as a moral choice between supporting American workers or relying on foreign rivals, which oversimplifies the actual challenge. Countries like China spent more than a decade investing in battery technology, manufacturing efficiency, and large-scale production capacity, allowing their companies to build cheaper, better EVs that the world wants. Meanwhile, US policy has swung between subsidies and protectionism, leaving domestic firms trying to compete behind a wall rather than on an open field. Tariffs make foreign EVs disappear from American showrooms, but they don't make American EVs more innovative. They simply hide the gap instead of closing it. Outside the US, automakers from Europe to Southeast Asia can purchase high-quality Chinese EVs at low cost, strengthening their own fleets and lowering operational expenses, while American companies remain locked out of the most competitive options. This dynamic weakens the very businesses the US needs to succeed in the global transition away from fossil fuels. The EV war is ultimately about who can build the smartest supply chain, the best battery, and the most affordable product, not who waves the biggest flag. And unless the US confronts this reality directly, it risks falling behind, not because other nations undermined it, but because it misunderstood the game it was actually playing. Around the world, nations are navigating the same pressures of technological change and global competition, but they are responding with strategies very different from the United States. Instead of insulating their markets with broad tariffs, many countries are leveraging global advantages to strengthen their own competitiveness. European firms buy the best components, whether they come from Germany or China, because they know their survival depends on cost, quality, and innovation, not political symbolism. Southeast Asian economies blend domestic manufacturing with foreign partnerships to keep prices low and technology moving forward. Even Canada and Mexico, America's closest partners, openly integrate global supply chains to give their industries the flexibility needed to compete. This willingness to adopt the world's best tools gives foreign companies a structural advantage. They can operate more efficiently, adapt faster, and offer products at prices American firms struggle to match. Meanwhile, US businesses are forced to work with a limited toolbox, unable to access leading technologies because political narratives make foreign products unacceptable, even when they are superior. The result is a quiet divergence in global competitiveness. While other nations treat economic policy as a long-term strategy, the US increasingly treats it as a moral argument, a loyalty test, or a political performance. The rest of the world is playing to win the economic future. America is playing to win the next election cycle, and in that gap, competitors find space to grow stronger. The most persistent contradiction in modern US economic policy is the belief that protecting certain industries automatically protects the nation as a whole. It's a comforting idea, emotionally satisfying and politically powerful, but it clashes with how competitive systems actually work. When tariffs, restrictions, or special protections are introduced to shield one sector, the benefits are highly concentrated, while the costs spread quietly across the rest of the economy. A factory worker may keep a job for now, but every business that needs cheaper inputs, better technology, or more efficient vehicles becomes less competitive globally. This imbalance doesn't appear immediately. It shows up slowly, in declining export strength, shrinking market share, and foreign rivals gaining momentum, while American firms operate with outdated or overpriced tools. The contradiction deepens because leaders frame these policies as defenses against foreign threats, when in reality they often create domestic weaknesses by limiting innovation and encouraging complacency. The very industries being saved lose the pressure to evolve, while industries that need world-class tools to grow are forced to operate at a disadvantage. Over time, this pattern traps the country between nostalgia and necessity, trying to preserve the past while ignoring the future.
And because the narrative is wrapped in patriotic language, it becomes difficult for citizens to recognize that the policies meant to secure American power may actually be eroding it from within. The intention is protection. The outcome is fragility. Much of the public conversation frames America's economic challenges as battles against foreign rivals, China stealing manufacturing, Europe outpacing innovation, or global markets threatening jobs. But these narratives miss the deeper issue. The vulnerabilities shaping America's trajectory are largely self-created, built from decades of policy choices that prioritized short-term profit over national resilience. The decline didn't begin with China's rise or global competition. It began when the country allowed its own industrial capacity, worker skills, and technological foundations to erode while reassuring itself that market forces would magically correct everything. Foreign nations may be competitors, but they are not the architects of America's weaknesses. Those weaknesses were designed at home, through fragmented strategies, political performances, and an unwillingness to confront uncomfortable structural problems. Even now, the debate focuses on blaming external threats rather than examining why domestic companies struggle to innovate, why critical industries depend on foreign inputs, or why policy shifts create volatility instead of stability. From my alien perspective, admittedly biased toward planets that enjoy long-term planning, humans seem remarkably skilled at fighting the wrong enemy. They treat global competition as sabotage, while ignoring the slow, internal processes, hollowing out their own foundations. The future will not be determined by which country America fears, but by whether it can reconcile the contradictions within its own economic model. When you strip away the slogans, the speeches, and the political performances, national security becomes something far more practical than dramatic. It is a mirror reflecting the true condition of a country's economy. A strong nation is one that invests in its people, builds competitive industries, and adapts as technology reshapes the world. A vulnerable nation is one that hides behind symbolic protections while avoiding the deeper reforms needed to stay relevant. The United States often talks about danger in terms of foreign threats, but the more pressing danger comes from the choices made within its own borders. Choices that allow critical skills to disappear, infrastructure to age, and technological leadership to slip away. The most revealing part of this debate is how rarely leaders acknowledge that strength is not produced by tariffs, patriotic language, or political toughness. It is produced by the capacity to innovate and compete in a rapidly changing global environment. National security is not something a country buys, protects with walls, or restores through fear-driven policies. It is something earned every day through economic clarity and strategic investment. The uncomfortable truth is that America's greatest opponent is not another nation, but its own resistance to honest self-assessment. When a country begins believing its narratives more than its numbers, it risks drifting into decline without noticing the turning point. Real security demands the courage to see the weaknesses in the reflection, and the will to change them before the world forces the issue. As we reach the end of this breakdown, I want to leave you with a moment of reflection rather than another argument. Every nation tells stories about itself, stories of strength, resilience, and certainty. But the truth is always more complicated and sometimes more uncomfortable. The choices a country makes today quietly shape the future its citizens will inherit, and those choices deserve honest discussion, not slogans. So I want to ask you directly, what part of this conversation struck you the most? Was it the way national security gets used to sell economic decisions, or the realization that many of our vulnerabilities were built from the inside out? Do you believe America is strengthening itself, or drifting without a clear strategy? Your answers matter, because a country's direction isn't just determined in government offices. It is shaped by the awareness and engagement of the people watching, thinking, and questioning decisions that impact their lives. If you want deeper context, I encourage you to watch the previous video, where we explored another piece of this larger puzzle. These analyses take time, research, and a genuine commitment to helping you see the full picture, not just the headlines.
If you find value in that, subscribing is one of the simplest ways to support this work. It's just a click, but it helps us keep creating videos that cut through noise and explain what's really happening beneath the surface.